Welcome back, everyone. Sorry for the technical issues. Sorry about that. We are back here. Hit the like button to get the stream back on track. Yeah, hit the like button. I think the audio is fine. All right, let's do this. Where were we? I think we were talking about the nuclear escalations. This whole show, everybody, this whole show is about Trump administration blowing up on multiple fronts. Russia, China, West Asia, Venezuela. We were just talking about the nuclear drills that Russia is conducting right now as we speak. And the sanctions that Trump just put on Russia in an attempt to pressure Russia to the table. We've heard this all before. So how about we get to you, Elina? Pick up where you had left off.
I'm just trying to gather my thoughts, so without wanting to sound repetitive. Um, yeah, so as I was discussing effectively is that what we're currently seeing is the fact that China, Iran, and Russia are understanding that the West is pushing for war, whether it's directly through NATO and Russia, but also we're also going to see an escalation with Iran, and so they're preparing for that, and that is why they no longer want to share any sort of information or intelligence related to nuclear capabilities, even with regards to the West, and is sending a strong message that this multipolar alliance is forming effectively is ready to counter any sort of Western aggression, whether it's directly, whether it's through economic warfare or military if need be. And I also wanted to draw some attention with regards to as well some aspects of what's happening with Iran. I think in the last month as well, we've also seen the fact that the snapback mechanisms were obviously put in place, and this was a direct order by the United States to the E3 states as a means to sort of put economic and political pressure on Iran in order to sort of essentially go back to the negotiating table with the United States, or effectively risk any sort of new sort of a wave of war against Iran. And there's been multiple outlets in the form of the Washington Post and the Atlantic Council that have effectively been speaking about a new war against Iran that's in the making. And even the foreign minister, the Russian foreign minister Lavrov, had even come out and effectively said that based on his own personal sources, strikes against Iran are very likely, with the Washington Post specifically speaking about how the West is looking at a new low-intensity war on Iran, similar to what I guess Israel has been doing, let's just say, to the Palestinians. It specifically spoke about mowing the lawn, which is an Israeli military doctrine to sort of essentially weaken their opponent and economically asphyxiate them gradually without necessarily, it's like a protracted war and a war of attrition, which the West can't possibly win. But this is essentially what we're seeing take place with Iran as well. And this is what all the information is sort of gearing towards. And Iran itself is preparing by, engaging in a new deal right now with China, where they're going to be given advanced weapons and air defense systems in exchange for oil. And simultaneously, they've just entered into new sort of, military purchases with Russia, fighter jets specifically, in order to obviously prepare for the war that's coming on Iran. And so you can see here that all Russia, China, and Iran have a good understanding that they're preparing themselves at this point for a military confrontation with the West at different periods, but they are all preparing for it. And I think that's what's very significant as well about the new stage, of the snapback mechanisms being put in place. The fact that Iran did not submit to Western pressure in order to essentially go to the negotiating table and be abused into submission, because we also have to remember the terms that the United States imposed for Iran to come back to the negotiating table is no uranium enrichment at all, which is a violation of international law. We have to remember that is a violation of international law. That's one aspect. The second aspect is that the United States demanded that Iran that they have complete access to Iran's nuclear facilities to be able to enter Iran, to quote Trump, and do as they wish, take what they want, and destroy what they want. So we're talking about the neocolonization of Iran rather directly. And simultaneously, they're also speaking, of course, about Iran having to to stop any sort of military alliance or support of any of its so-called proxies, or what the West called proxies within the region. And obviously, all of this is simply unacceptable to Iran. And they try to use economic coercion. That's what they're trying to do. But rather than submit, Iran is saying no, and they're preparing alongside China and Russia, in essence, to sort of galvanize towards this what they understand will be a major war against all these three countries aligned. And now, to the extent that that will be successful, well, that's a bit of a different story. It will be very highly unsuccessful. But yes, it's a severe escalation towards the direction of what the West is looking to achieve, and that is war and destruction in order to preserve their own hegemony and to explore new markets and be able to exploit those new markets for themselves, for their short-term profit gains. But in the end, will ultimately sort of collapse on itself.
Mm. Yeah, and KJ, talk about the significance of the nuclear preparedness, to get back on this question for those who might have missed it. We have Russia conducting nuclear drills, and then you also have even, the responsible statecraft, which is the Quincy Institute. They have talked about how Russia, China, and Iran have, they've informed the United Nations that not only do they not see the snapback sanctions as legitimate, they won't be following them, but that nuclear restrictions are now completely off. The JPCPOA is dead. What's the significance of this? There is looming nuclear conflict. The Trump administration seems more interested in trying to pressure through bullying everybody who he sees as in the way of some kind of U.S. first policy. But at the same time, this nuclear question becomes more and more dire. What's your take on this?
Well, the way I see it is that, there's a kind of desperation which is starting to set in the administration. They're asking themselves, what are the options that we have? And the option, the option of last resort is always nuclear warfare. This was certainly the case. It was an option that was considered during the Korean War. It was exercised during World War II. It was certainly considered during Vietnam. Certainly the French wanted the US to use tactical nuclear weapons, etc. So we're looking at if the nuclear option is something that is on the table. And if you remember, Donald Trump said, in his first administration, he said, I have these nuclear weapons. Why can't I use them? Well, I mean, at that point, he was dismissed as being, a lunatic. But if you look at the policy papers, everything that has come out since that period has all been about using nuclear weapons as part of the continuum of war. And I think it's also important to remember that since the 1980s, the U.S. Nuclear war doctrine has been what is called counterforce. Essentially, it is the belief that if you escalate to nuclear weapons, the party that uses them first wins. Essentially, you want to get in a nuclear sucker punch in, and if you can do that, then you kind of pick off anything else that is launched in retaliation with missile defense, and then you win. There is a large portion of the ruling imperial elite that believe that nuclear weapons are the way to go. And you see this with, for example, in the Ukraine war, where the Ukraine proxies were firing directly on Russia's strategic arsenal, the strategic bomber base. And so when you take these things into consideration, what we see here is Russia is exercising its nuclear triad and sending the message as clearly as possible. Do not think that you can get away with a counterforce strike. That is not going to be acceptable. And they're trying to send the message that you need to, come to Jesus and really understand, that nuclear deterrence still holds despite your theory of nuts or counterforce doctrine.
Yeah, definitely. And Elina, we have these sanctions that have been put on Russia, and as the Trump administration makes his way to Asia, depending on when people see this, he might have already had this meeting. But it's curious. What he said was that he wants China to help the United States pressure Russia to end the conflict. Now, we've heard this before, right, Elina? Didn't the Biden administration constantly say this? So we have a kind of playing at peace by the Trump administration, but touting a kind of aggressive stance where he tries to pull in anybody he can, especially China, to get Russia to submit. Will this work? They couldn't get Iran to submit. Iran hasn't submitted at all. Iran, there was a near all-out war last summer, and Iran hasn't submitted. Now they want China to get Russia to submit. Seems familiar.
Yeah, the problem is that the United States and Trump in particular is trying to negotiate or coerce, China with a card that it simply does not have. So it's trying to use economic warfare in order to placate China and to coerce it to say, all right, well, we'll cooperate because, because of the tariff warfare, et cetera. But the reality of the situation is, and this has already been proven since the great day of liberation up until this point, with the first sort of initiation of the new stage of the trade warfare against China, is that the United States doesn't have the economic ability anymore from the moment that it has been deindustrialized, and the vast majority of its of supply chains are within the global south and predominantly within China itself. They doesn't have the capability to be able to blackmail China into anything. And using economic coercion especially seems absolutely ridiculous, to say the least. I mean, they're currently now going to be meeting supposedly to find some sort of agreement with China. I think the negotiations are beginning today, and obviously China is simultaneously also using its rare earth metals, which it obviously has a monopoly on, but producing something like 61% of rare earth metals, as well as processing around 92%, which is essential to the United States, who's also trying to wage war around the world with incredibly powerful adversaries, yet lacks the sort of missiles and artillery and air defense systems to be able to engage in warfare. And because it doesn't have an industry, because it relies on the countries of the global south as such, because, like I said, it exported the vast majority of its industries and supply chains, which is pretty much the modus operandi of how capitalism operates, given the fact that the United States has now become a financial capitalist country. And it's now trying to blackmail China, that has what it needs if it wants to continue being not just a military power, and in order to obviously import the sort of rare earth that it needs in order to continue its military production to fund its wars, which, like I said, doesn't even have the industrial capacity, but also for it requires these rare earth metals even for its AI, and its Silicon Valley requires it in order to obviously preserve its so-called status as the leader in technology, which no longer is necessarily the case, as published recently by the New York Times, that actually said that Silicon Valley looks to China with envy, but therefore kind of proving that a state-run economy is able to actually produce at a more efficient rate than one that is sort of profit-driven and such as the United States. But beyond that point, as I was trying to say, is that the United States doesn't have the power, the economic leverage to coerce China into basically persuading Russia to surrender. And all of this at this point is just political posturing on behalf of the United States to prove that it still has some sort of leverage, but it doesn't actually have that capability. And therefore, again, we're probably going to see the United States either act out or have to surrender, because if like Iran did not surrender to the United States through sanctions, China, who is the world's industrial superpower, is definitely not going to be the one to do so.
Well, KJ, the British, the UK, they leveled sanctions before the Trump administration did, very specifically on these two oil giants of Russia. The British leveled oil sanctions on Russia to ratchet up tensions in order to target, because this is what they're doing. They're targeting BRICS countries now, China and India. They're trying and seemingly failing to get them to stop trading with Russia. Stop trading in Russian oil. And what China did to these British sanctions is say, we're just going to keep trading with Russia. What is different here? It seems like that there's nothing really the United States can do or the collective West can do to stop China, to stop the rest of the world from trading in Russian oil. And mind you, the European Union, which said they're going to sanction Russian gas, they can't even do that for another year plus, or if not more. This is kind of the kicking the can down the road. What do you make of this situation?
Yeah, I think as Elena said, the U.S. has run out of cards to play, and it's simply huffing and puffing and threatening to blow the house down, which it can't do anymore. I mean, you have to understand that this has been a long, slow process. If you think of like chess games, they're very aggressive chess players, and then there are chess players who are simply building structure, connecting pieces, and making sure that every last weak piece is strengthened. And then at that point, they move towards the end game. We're moving into the end game. And at this point, the structure is so strong and integral that it cannot be taken down. Any kind of aggressive gambit that's done by, the counterparty is not going to work, simply because it's so, the positions and the structures have been so clearly and capably built out. And so, as Elena pointed out, one of the key moves that China has made, and it is a real power move, is controls on rare earth elements. Just to go back into a little bit, basic, science, rare earth elements are the lanthanide group or the lanthanoid group. There are 15 elements that have very, very specific and rare qualities specifically related to magnetism and luminescence and other metallic lanthanoid qualities. I have said for many, many years now that when the US put tech sanctions on China, in particular chip sanctions, I had predicted that China would be able to overcome those chip sanctions very rapidly, because technology develops. You can simply develop technology. It's just a matter of investment and research and innovation, etc. All of those things are built into the Chinese system. On the other hand, you cannot invent a new rare earth element. That block of elements, the lanthanides, is set, and you are not going to do new things to electron structure and invent new elements. That is kind of a sealed deal. And China has been developing rare earth elements since the 1970s, since 1972. And it has had premiers who were engineers and scientists in rare earth elements. So they understood this 50 years ago, that this was going to be strategically important. And now that process is almost complete. The structure is almost complete. They have monopoly over the refining of rare earth elements. And it's the refining processes which really are, the challenging part of rare earth elements. As many people have pointed out, rare earth elements are not rare. You have them in your teeth. Every time you make an element, every time you make an omelet, there are rare earth elements in that. The problem is you'd have to make a lot of omelets or grind up a lot of teeth to get enough rare earth elements to be, to use them in a meaningful fashion. And that is exactly the problem that China has solved. It's found a way to use industrial processes to refine and concentrate these rare earth elements to the point that they can actually be used and combined with other elements and then used in everything that is electronic. Everything since the 1960s onwards. In fact, the entire field of electronics is really reliant on rare earth elements. It is, people think that it's about silicon. Yes, silicon is part of it, gallium is part of it, but it's really the rare earth elements, the things that make electromagnetic force manipulable and transducible, that has given rise to modern, the modern technology, the ICT technology. And so because China has a monopoly on this process, on this supply chain, the fact that they have put this out and yanked that chain has suddenly woken the United States up. And they have realized that they are out of options, in particular in regards to the manufacture of weapons, radars, guidance systems, night vision systems, screens. All of these things are dependent on rare earth elements. And China has just pulled the chain and said, remember, we control this entire dimension of of industry, and perhaps you and I need to sit down and have a reasonable dialogue rather than you continuing to threaten and try to intimidate us. As I said before, the only thing that the United States has left, the final ace in the hole, if you will, is nuclear escalation. And this is the message that the US and other countries are trying to send. This is what the Russia is trying to send. Don't even think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you have China with the rare earths. That is, as you said, KJ, that's a huge point of leverage for China and just all across the board. Russia with their nuclear drills sending a huge message that, yeah, this isn't going to go well if you continue on this path for the United States. And then, Elina, we also have a situation where, as the U.S. appears to be out of options with the Russias, the Chinas, even the Irans, now it's moving toward Venezuela. Marco Rubio is being credited with a major policy shift for Donald Trump, where the United States has been hitting boat after boat after boat, boats with Trinidadians, boats with Colombians. Dozens upon dozens of people have been killed in these strikes over the last several months. And here's a direct quote from Donald Trump to the press. He said, "I don't think we're going to ask for a declaration of war." This is to Congress. "I think we're just going to kill people. Okay, we're just going to kill them. They're going to be like dead." Elina, talk about the connections here, because Venezuela right now is being looked at in a vacuum in a lot of senses. But it appears to me that not only is Venezuela deeply connected to this global push that the Trump administration is making, the U.S. is making toward a full-scale, even nuclear war, but Venezuela has its own importance to this larger world order. What's your thoughts and assessment on this?
All right, so Venezuela is very significant, and it is deeply connected, obviously, to the imperialist wars that are basically taking place now. And it's important, obviously, to contextualize it. So, on the one hand, Venezuela is obviously an ally. It's part of the BRIC states. It's part of the BRIC states. It's part of the BRI. It's also obviously an oil-rich country that has aligned itself alongside, obviously, China and Russia, and is entering into a lot of trade deals and negotiations that would allow Venezuela to bypass the sanctions and the economic warfare that the U.S. has been imposing on it for the past 20 to 25 years, possibly looking as well at the construction of its own oil refineries, which up until recently in its history, it was not able to attain, fundamentally because prior to Chavez, the entire purpose of kind of controlling Venezuela was also to prevent Venezuela from being able to establish its own oil refineries, as it obviously uses its oil refineries in the United States, obviously therefore allowing the United States to be able to kind of hold control over Venezuela and its economic and sovereign independence. So now that the United States, now that Venezuela has obviously, not only just been able to push back against Western imperialism for 25 years, but it's due to, like I said before, we have a change in the material conditions of the world. The multipolar world is now being born with alternatives to the Western sort of hegemonic financial and economic kind of bubble. And China and Russia, as well as Iran and the entirety of the BRICS and the BRI, are going to provide Venezuela with an opportunity to be able to prosper outside of that, and therefore also acting as a gateway within the rest of Latin America in order to kind of basically galvanize Chinese sort of influence through the investment of infrastructure and the development of trade routes that will be basically bypassing the West. So Venezuela is presenting, it's a country, like I said, rich in resources, but also defiant. It defies the United States and in its own so-called backyard, because that is how the United States views Latin America and Venezuela in particular. Simultaneously, what's happening in Venezuela, the escalation that we're seeing in Venezuela is obviously also connected to Iran and the sort of general, I would even say, and I even made a piece about this, it's even connected to the the ceasefire that took place in Gaza and between Hamas and obviously Israel, if you want to call it a ceasefire. The reason that actually has come to be is fundamentally because the United States cannot keep funding, obviously, a genocide and a war inside of Gaza anymore. They're going to be moving forward towards a more low-intensity warfare, and they're going to essentially try to refocus their projects towards Iran and Venezuela. Because as going back to the previous conversation, the United States does not actually have the industrial capacity to be able to produce a type of weapons in order to basically sustain multi-front wars with Ukraine, Iran, and Venezuela, but also obviously the amount of munitions and weapons and air defense systems, etc., that Israel was obviously burning through. So that's happened. The so-called ceasefire there has happened, and you're now seeing obviously the other West Asian Arab states sort of coming in to take over Gaza, primarily to create this sort of division of labor, where now the Arab states are going to take control over the Strip and put pressure on the resistance there. It's much like the European Union is going to basically be taking control over the Eastern Front with Russia, aka sort of allowing the NATO states of Europe to go to war with Russia, in order to allow the United States to sort of focus as well on other fronts, that being the collective towards China, but also now it's going to be focusing on Venezuela itself. And so all these operations now that we're seeing in Venezuela, the bombing of these fishermen boats, essentially, I mean, this is the information that's coming out without any legal due process. This is a form of piracy. Let's also make that very clear. You have the United States that's bombing people in international waters, much like its proxy in West Asia. Fishermen boats, innocent civilians are being killed. Nobody's being held accountable because it's the United States. Obviously, again, bringing to question the entire legal order and the whole concept of international law, where the United States can just simply do whatever it wants. But in doing so, and there's the great military buildup, being the largest military buildup in the Caribbean since 1994, when the United States engaged in another sort of regime change in Haiti, and they're preparing effectively to essentially aid the so-called opposition militias inside of Venezuela in order to overthrow the government, and they're using narco-terrorism as pretext, much like the war on terror in Iraq. It's a very sort of similar kind of framework that we've seen multiple times. They need to find a pretext, and they don't even necessarily need to justify it. I mean, the Bush administration, when it came to Iraq, if we go back, he did say, the absence of evidence isn't the evidence of absence, or whatever that little, postulation was. They don't require the evidence. They act above the law. And yet again, they're going to use the concept of terrorism to engage in regime change in Latin America. And Maria Corina Machado, which is the opposition leader that is pretty much the sweetheart of the imperialists in the United States, has actively come out and said that there is mass mobilizations, according to her, taking place in the underground sort of Venezuela, and there's what she calls is going to be a choreographed movement against Maduro, which is going to be sort of choreographed alongside, obviously, the Trump administration, who's in constant contact with her. So what's going to be happening in Venezuela, and this is sort of my estimation, is that you're going to see the United States, who's already ramped up its military around the region, try to target and possibly invade Venezuela, while simultaneously arming and funding groups inside of Venezuela to create a sort of civil conflict, blood loss, in order to completely overthrow the Bolivarian revolutionary state, establish a puppet state, so as to, and this is the important aspect, again, splinter the BRI, splinter BRICS, and obviously, again, this goes towards controlling. When you control as well Venezuela, you control the oil market, and by controlling the oil market, you're going to try to impose warfare on Russia, Iran, and China simultaneously by controlling the oil market. So that's sort of the situation in Venezuela, and how obviously connects to all the other events to a certain extent that are happening globally.
Yeah, and KJ, the USS Gerald Ford is now in the sea nearing Venezuelan shores. It is parked in the Caribbean now. And Maduro, to Alina's point, he has not only said exactly what she said about the pretext that is being used, narco-terrorism, to justify war, but also he thanked Russia and China for the weapons and the support that they've given to defend the country. Is this Is this going to go as the U.S. plans? Because there seems to be a huge margin for error, meaning there's a huge space that could be occupied for massive error and massive blowback. What's your take?
I think there's tremendous miscalculation going on the part of the United States. If the U.S. is considering land wars, it doesn't do well in land wars in general. It certainly doesn't do well in jungle wars, of which Venezuela is largely jungle, and also lots of mountains as well. It didn't do well in Afghanistan either. So if it wants to send in, and it certainly doesn't have the manpower to do a real land war. If it is going to do counterinsurgency, well, they have their doctrine of counterinsurgency that they've been developing for 20 years since Afghanistan. All of these people have been shown to be complete frauds and idiots. They've lost every single one of them. It is true that when the US engages in small wars, in counterinsurgency wars, it usually funds them through narcotics or narco-terrorism. That goes back to the 1940s and 50s when they used when the KMT, when the US supported the KMT to wage guerrilla warfare against China on the Yunnan border by developing the narco-terrorist, narco-trafficking a region of Myanmar. This is what led to what we later refer to as quote unquote the French Connection. And then that narco trafficking cabal was also used to wage war during the Vietnam War to support the ethnic minorities that the US had recruited to fight against Laos, Cambodia, and China. And then also during the dirty wars in Latin America against Nicaragua and El Salvador. Once again, the kind of use of narco trafficking to support dirty wars was all part of this gangster, capitalist, terrorist structure that was never dismantled. All of that is still in place. And certainly it's possible that you will see this kind of regime change, dirty war being reenacted. But even that is reaching its limits, partly because technology is much, much more advanced. The kind of easy and cheap dirty wars that the United States was waging, that has become much, much harder because of the way in which kind of a network panopticon and electronic jamming can be done both by the United States, but also by China and Russia and other powers. So that is much, much harder to do. So you really have to rely on kind of artisanal deception, such as you saw in the Lebanon war with the pager attacks. And then the other thing is, as Elena said, once again, we see this direct return to piracy. Literally, it's capitalist imperialism returning to its origins of primitive accumulation, but this direct return to piracy. So not only just blasting people out of the water, fishermen just fishing on a pretext, but also I remind you that the Dutch have just simply taken over the Chinese company Nexperia. It's owned by the Chinese, the chip company, and this is reminiscent of what the Dutch did in 1603 when they simply pirated and attacked a Portuguese carrack called Santa Catarina. And this gave rise to the doctrine of the open oceans, or mare liberum. Essentially, they were saying that, it was on the open oceans. The oceans belong to everybody. If you're on the open oceans, we get to take it. We get to do whatever we want to. And this is actually the foundation of modern Western international law, as was espoused by Hugo Grotius. And so we can see this kind of reversion to kind of this early primitive accumulation, piracy, terrorism, dirty wars, and all of these things, despite the violence and the stupidity of all of this, is still yet more signals of weakness, of desperation. And I think that the US is going to be in for a very, very difficult battle if it thinks that it's going to walk over Venezuela. I think Venezuela is ready and prepared, but more than that, I think both Russia and China are prepared to support Venezuela in unseen but powerful ways.
Yeah. Yeah, and then there's this question, Alina, of the trade war. You know, the United States, Donald Trump is talking to Xi Jinping. He is essentially threatening even higher tariffs on China should it leverage its rare earths, should it continue to stop buying soybeans from the United States, on and on and on. Should China continue its export controls and regulations? And then there's exactly what KJ said, this fact that Venezuela is very much a part of now what is increasingly a China-led world economic order. How is it that Trump then, like, how do you see the Trump administration's kind of bandying about and flailing about as a byproduct of a very difficult and challenging dynamic facing the United States empire?
So the United States is facing, the best way to put it, it's the ultimate fall, or rather consequences of the contradictions of its sort of capitalist structures. Up until obviously, up to World War, II, and a little after World War II, obviously the United States was an industrial powerhouse of its own. But obviously the rules of economics dictate that at a certain particular point, unless you're willing to basically change the modus, sort of the way in which you sort of function, your economic system, and therefore create a more centralized planning system that will allow for a state to control its industries rather than being completely profit driven, eventually all avenues of profit or profit creation will eventually diminish, as essentially the constant need to create will outpass all forms of demand, therefore reducing the profit, which is why globalization and sort of the neoliberal order took place in the 80s with Reagan and Thatcher in the UK, which saw like a new rise in, the new neoliberal order that expanded and exported all of its production capacity abroad, as I've said earlier, and in a way to kind of rectify its own contradictions within the United States, it turned into this financial capitalist hub, relying as well on the dollar itself to be able to obviously fund itself. It's become a speculative bubble of an economy that is nothing more than a Ponzi scheme. And this is primarily because, as I've said, it's a profit-driven economy. As it currently stands, the United States no longer has the kind of capacity to threaten anybody. The only thing, and I think it was the Responsible Statescraft that actually even published a piece in the last week stating that there is really no way for the United States to be able to even sustain wars against Venezuela, wars against Russia, wars against Iran, and most definitely not with China. And I would actually even try to remind people of a report that came out from the CSIS in 2023 that even said, and this was before the wars in West Asia, before October 7th had actually taken place. And even at that point, the report had found that the United States would not be able to militarily last more than 1 week against a Taiwan Strait war with China. And this is very telling. And in fact, the CSI report actually concluded that the war will not be won through military means, but actually through the country's industrial capacity and base, of which the United States does not have that capability anymore. And so now all the kind of speculative and financial bubble of an economy that the United States has created in order to sustain itself is reaching a boiling point where effectively it has to make a decision. Either it will stop its sort of imperialist ambitions abroad and start to look at reindustrializing its own economy and investing back into its own economy in order to sort of at least safeguard what it can and save itself. But that would ultimately therefore mean that it would no longer be the world's global reserve currency, because let's remember, in economics, there's something called the Triffin dilemma, which essentially states that the United States, given the fact that it's the world's global reserve currency, it has to act like the world's consumer, because it has to import everything. It has to become, it has to maintain that sort of status in order to be able to produce and be able to pump enough dollars into the global economy in order to facilitate the fact that the dollar is the global reserve currency. And so if tomorrow the United States was to look at reindustrializing and sort of actually focusing on, making America great again, which is kind of the narrative that Trump was selling to his support base, then that would ultimately mean that the United States will lose its so-called superpower status. It would no longer be the world's global reserve currency, and it would no longer be a state that will be funded by, foreign countries buying its own capital assets, which is the means by which the United States has been able to sustain itself. So now the state the United States is at is that it's deindustrialized. It doesn't have the industrial base or capacity to be able to confront the adversaries that it has. It wasn't even able to actually accomplish anything against, a small scale operation against Yemen, where it used about, I think 80 Tomahawk missiles, and it produces between 55 and 90 per year, because it doesn't have the industrial capacity, and it also doesn't have the resources of which China is obviously has the monopoly over, as we discussed earlier with regards to its rare earth resources. So the United States simply cannot. There is no means by which it can actually going to war with even with Venezuela. The chances of success, even in Venezuela, but especially against Iran, especially and let's not even talk about Russia or China. It's more so going to stretch itself thin, and eventually at some particular point it's going to erupt. The debt bubble that the United States is in will erupt, and it will eventually lead to political and economic chaos within the imperial core, unless, as I said, it was to change trajectory, which unfortunately the ruling classes in corporate America is not willing to do, because if it was to do that, it would see a huge reduction in its profit-making capabilities, and a lot of these financial sort of powerhouses, and financial institutions would become effectively, would probably even kind of go bankrupt. They would no longer be functioning as institutions anymore. So this is sort of the dilemma of the United States, and why it's a lot of these ambitions that it has abroad just simply are not economically, politically, or even militarily feasible.
Yeah, great points, Elina. And KJ, The Economist just said that China is winning the trade war. It says, quote, "It has learned to escalate and retaliate as effectively as the United States, and it's experimenting with its own extraterritorial trade rules, thus changing the path of the world economy." It's always whenever China is winning, according to the Western mainstream media, it is doing so through nefarious means. And that's why we always have the "but at what cost" for everyone else who is on the receiving end of China's economic miracle. But maybe you could talk about KJ. There's also a report in the Rand Corporation, which is arguing that the United States and China should actually start settling down, and that there should be maybe a possible temporary retreat. So there is a bit of concern, it seems like, in even the military establishment, as well as the overall establishment in the collective West, about these wars that Trump is pursuing. Well, talk about your thoughts and your assessment of this.
It's too early to tell. We're seeing mixed signals, and there are certain people, who I think are good observers of the geopolitical landscape, who say, well, the U.S. is dialing back. It is already in retreat. But if you look carefully, you will see that they're very, very clearly at the very least, mixed messages going on. For example, if you look at the RAND document, go onto the RAND website, and you will also see there's some very, very aggressive papers talking about strengthening the U.S. alliance with Taiwan and making it more effective. So this is simply one article from RAND, but we notice it because we watch what these deep state think tanks are saying, and they are saying that the United States and China should look for a stable modus vivendi. okay, a way to coexist peacefully. Now, if you go in and drill in on the details, and they say, if you look at the Rand Corporation, they say, well, we want a modus vivendi over a specific period, such as 3 to 5 years. Okay, so essentially they're saying we just want things to calm down for 3 to 5 years. How about, having, some kind of permanent agreement? How about the next few decades? Or is it just that you're looking for time to reload? That is, the US is doing its own version of hide and bide. And then also they're saying, they need to, both sides need to, especially avoid things that undermine the deterrent and defensive capabilities of the other. Okay, I think they're talking really about rare earth elements. They're saying, come on, guys, give us the rare earth elements. And then, everything else that they're saying seems so weak and milquetoast. They're saying, for example, clarify U.S. objectives in the rivalry with language that explicitly rejects absolute versions of victory and accepts the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. So are they saying that they want to recognize the CPC, or are they saying that we just need to tweak the language? So I think there are many, many things here that are, if you look at the details, it is not so de-escalatory. It simply looks like some kind of stratagem for de-escalating momentarily so that we can re-escalate later. In other words, we need a little tactical pause for reloading. And I think this goes back to the larger picture, which again, as Elina has pointed out, is that the US is facing a structural crisis. That structural crisis is not simply an issue of deindustrialization. Of course, that is part of the picture, but it's an issue of de-skilling. The US has de-skilled its workforce. It no longer trains people, especially the vast majority of vast majority of the population, to do the kind of work that is necessary in an industrial economy. And so because of that de-skilling, then what do you have? Well, of course, as we know, if we understand the way that monopoly capitalism functions, once you have monopolies, you financialize. So this is why, if you want to order a burrito on DoorDash, DoorDash will pop up, and say, would you like to pay for that in 4 easy installments? This tells us several things. Already, they would just as soon as not have somebody working to make the burrito. They would just like to claw out the money through interest, through financial means. But also it means that, people are so busy that they no longer are capable of attending to their own meal needs. Plus, it also speaks to the fact that there is such an emphasis on financialization and of clawing out rents, of the kind of a rentier structure. If you have a rentier structure, essentially you have money making claim on money without anything productive being created in between. Under those circumstances, you are going to certainly face collapse eventually. The contradictions are irresolvable. Usually the way to resolve these contradictions is to have some kind of imperial war that allows you to expand your claim on other productive forces and other productive economies. But without that, essentially, you're facing attrition and collapse. And so then inside this situation where you have a financialized economy threatening to go to war, which would essentially largely be industrial war against major industrial economies, that is, recipe for total catastrophe. And once again, what is the ace in the pocket? What are they relying on? You have to ask yourself, are they thinking that they are going to use nuclear weapons? Are they thinking of tactical nuclear weapons? The other thing I'll also point out is that, the DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and they recently put out a bid for new technologies to deal with mass bloodshed, essentially how to use new technologies, including AI and other scanning technologies to staunch massive hemorrhage in the torso. What that tells you is that they are expecting industrial levels of death, casualty, and bloodshed. And they're trying to see if there's a way to create an automated system that they can place inside the combat theater that will diminish the level of death and casualty resulting from this. And we know this already because, people like John Nagel, who was the who was one of the key architects of the Cohen strategy for the Afghan war, has said that the US expects 3,600 casualties per day when it goes to war with a peer competitor. 3,600 casualties. That's more casualties in 2 weeks than the US had during, for example, the entire Vietnam War. And so I think that there are differing sectors of the US ruling imperial elite. Some of them are hunkering down and seeking massive industrial warfare, including nuclear war. And then we have other factors that are trying to send signals that we want to de-escalate. But to be honest, I don't know how trustworthy these messages of de-escalation are. Certainly the RAND document does not impress me. And it may simply be more subterfuge and deceit while they seek a tactical pause in order to reload.
Yeah, Elina, respond to this because, you have China winning a trade war with the United States, very much, as KJ said, prepared for a larger war if the U.S. wants it. China has said this itself, that it's ready for any kind of war if the U.S. really wants to go there, but it doesn't want to go there. And it seems like everything that China has done is to prevent this. Same with Iran, same with Russia. You still have Russia saying that they want to talk to the Trump administration, that they do not want relations to go further awry. And you also have Iran, despite being very vigorous and firm on its stance and not negotiating with the parties that have attacked it. It is still very much committed to building a peaceful war. How do you see, there's a lot of pessimism these days about the overall world situation. How do you see how these powers have handled Trump's aggression, given everything KJ just said and what we've been covering? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry.
You muted yourself.
Well, yeah, sorry. I think all of them have handled it somewhat differently. For example, in the case of Russia has been slowly yet incrementally, obviously, using its own industrial base and its, at this point, self-sufficient economy to be able to tackle NATO in a war of attrition, and simultaneously, obviously, wearing down the enemy, understanding the enemy's, let's just say, limitations, and that it's its industrial capacity, and in doing so, at the most diplomatic level, obviously, they're constantly, reiterating that we're here to negotiate. We do want peace. We do not want this war. We just want our side to be, obviously, respected. And they've been rather consistent in that. Whereas, for example, the United States has been rather erratic in its approach. It seems to make incredible sensationalist statements for the vast majority of the time. And when Trump had actually even come into power, he was making a lot of, obviously, claims as to ending the war that were without actually even providing a means or a sort of actual point, enumerated plan as to what he was actually going to offer Russia, who had already made their points rather clear, how it is that they were going to do so. And, it was obvious from the very beginning that that Trump would not be able to, achieve a ceasefire in Ukraine without essentially having to concede or effectively continuing the war. And so what does that actually do? The United States' chaotic behavior overall, contradict that with obviously Russia, who's shown itself to be very militarily stable, economically stable, but also diplomatically very stable in its approach, is obviously it has it proven itself as a power to be reckoned with, and it's actually kind of to put it very simply, undermine the United States and the West and all its institutions. Iran, for its part, has obviously tried to engage in the same sort of diplomacy, allowing the United States to be the one to show itself as being the aggressor, allowing the United States and the West, rather, as a whole, and through its proxy, Israel, to be the ones to be deemed as the irrational actors, while Iran is consistently trying to obviously play along the rules of diplomacy. However, and I think what KJ also pretty much referenced is to, to what degree can we obviously trust the United States and also its diplomatic, it's not just on its diplomatic posture, but also the kind of policy papers that it produces. Because if we look at what happened with Iran, for example, prior to the 12-day war, it looked like the United States was looking towards seeking some sort of peaceful resolution with Iran, looking towards actually getting onto the negotiating table and even somewhat meeting them halfway. Whilst all that was taking place, we had an abundant amount of reports coming out from Axios, etc., including Israeli outlets at the time, that behind the scenes, and this was obviously then verified, the United States had actually been planning to strike Iran, and that the entire negotiation process was merely a ploy. And this obviously, again, references back to, like, a lot of these policy papers that we see these major deep state think tanks producing in terms of supposedly toning it down, which you cannot trust it. The fact of the matter is that the United States is an irrational actor. It is acting in desperation because it is losing power at a president's, at president's rates, and it cannot actually gain that power back in any way, shape, or form, fundamentally because of the economic conditions that obviously I outlined earlier. So the way I see it is that Iran, Russia, and China are continuing in a very stable way. They're allowing the United States to deplete itself by stretching itself thin in order to effectively try to retain its control and defeat Russia, or rather the BRI and BRICS, in multiple different areas when it doesn't have the economic base by which to do so. And in the meantime, they are using the diplomatic approach by which to kind of turn down the United States in all forms of negotiation without appearing as though they're the negligent parties, and forming new alliances, finding alternative economic and financial infrastructures to bypass the West. They are undermining the West rather significantly as well in the process, by finding these alternative means by which to become self-sufficient and establishing a parallel essential market at this point to the Western world, while simultaneously building their own economies and military base in order to prepare themselves for what an irrational actor like the United States is willing to do in order to preserve its power. So I think it's a very strategic, carefully calculated approach, but always being very cautious of their enemy that is, frankly, as I said, acting in desperation.
KJ, is it good enough? I know that there's a lot here to cover. All these mixed messages that Trump is sending on all of these fronts, the Trump administration, the United States at the lead of this imperial albatross. But on the other side, is it good enough how Russia, China, how Iran are handling these crises created by the U.S. empire, whether it's the fact that West Asia is, at any point there could be an imminent war, and Gaza really is just a stepping block for Israel and the United States, as horrific as that sounds, and what's happened to the Palestinian people. Ukraine, in a similar way, even though it's different in context, similar in circumstance. So, on and on and on all these fronts, Venezuela. Is it good enough how the rising multipolar world is handling these crises? Are they hitting back hard enough? A lot of people have criticized based on this because of maybe on the one hand a deep desire to see all of this stop, and maybe on the other a misunderstanding of how the world works. Your thoughts?
Well, I can understand people feeling that it's not enough, that there is certainly, extraordinary catastrophic suffering happening all over the world, not the least of which is in Gaza. And so I can understand people's impatience and even, they're upset. But we have to understand that this is a global system, and there is violence happening structurally all over the planet on a level and a scale that I think most people in the West are just barely starting to grasp. They're just barely starting to understand this. And of course, as you point out, the inconsistency of the messaging is not simply Trump. We saw this good cop, bad cop routine throughout the whole time with the Biden administration. They would play Jekyll and Hyde, good cop, bad cop, all the way through. And so there is certainly a level of deceit and inconsistency and contradiction that is constantly being messaged. But if we boil it down to the question, is it good enough? I would say that it's the best that can be done at the current moment, given the risks that we are facing. Essentially, what the Global South is trying to do is build out structures and positions that allow itself not to be taken down in toto, while the West is using regime change all over Southeast Asia right now, all over the Global South, as well as, escalating dirty wars, as well as, the escalation towards outright piracy, and then, nuclear threats, sanctions, etc. The entire 9 yards, everything is being put on the table. And in this situation, I think that there is something to be said for trying to de-escalate and minimize risks as you continue to build out, the necessary capacity for the Global South to end this structure of imperialism that has so plagued the planet for centuries.
Yeah, and Elina, same question to you. As I see it, the United States still is very good as an empire at violence and wreaking havoc, instability, genocide, mass murder, all of these things that give the United States' empire a kind of a basis in reality. But at the same time, when we think about Venezuela or Iran or Russia, China, these are examples where the United States empire, the violence, the kind of thrashing about, doesn't succeed. Now, some people have brought up Syria as a major success in the last several years for the United States, but still, that took many, 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 many years, and it took an incredible amount of investments from Israel, from Turkey, in that. That took over a decade, if not more, to achieve, and was a very specific and particular context in and of itself, one that cannot be, in my opinion, it cannot be reflected upon Russia or China or even Iran, which has a military arsenal far stronger, far more advanced than Syria ever had. So how do you see this situation, this overall moment, in terms of how these rising multipolar world leaders, maybe we can call them, are handling the thrashing of the empire?
So I was actually going to bring up Syria as soon as you sort of began the question, because Syria was to a certain extent, and I think we need to be very careful with regard to Syria. It was a win for the imperial core, for the imperialists, for the United States, fundamentally because obviously it allowed them to overthrow. Assad inside Syria. That was pretty much. I mean, Syria is the heart of the Levant. It was the hub of the intelligence military hub for the axis of resistance, which obviously provided a buffer for Iran, but also prevented Western imperialism from completely subjugating the region. Again, providing that resistance against empire, which since the fall of Syria, we have seen the impacts that has had on, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the sort of the major war that's also being imposed on Lebanon at the moment. We're also seeing a sort of escalation towards Lebanon at this particular stage, either pushing for a direct military Israeli intervention, but also a civil war within Lebanon, fundamentally because, they need to eradicate any sort of resistance factions and to establish these so-called economic zones in the south of Lebanon, much like they plan in Gaza, and all these aspirations that they have to reshape the Middle East and sort of bring it, thoroughly within their periphery and to push out essentially and economically isolate, so they think, China, Russia, and Iran. But having said that, we can see that it has had an impact on the resistance factions and therefore also on Iran itself. However, we should also tread very lightly, because a lot of these projects that the West tends to sort of embark on, and again, I want to sort of reference Syria and then I'll broaden it, is the fact that, yes, okay, they've brought down, the government in Syria. They've established a new sort of state of affairs by a very questionable administration, if you want to call them as such. With Jelani obviously having a history in, with Al Qaeda and ISIS and all these organizations that in many ways have had ties and financial assistance by the West over the years in different formats, and that has obviously been inherently problematic. However, what are we seeing in Syria? We're seeing a complete breakdown of a state. It's unable to actually consolidate power. There's constant internalized violence, which again the West is exploiting. But even by exploiting that internalized violence, the chaos doesn't allow it to establish the sort of economic trade routes and corridors and peace that it needs in order to be able to establish itself. So it's a success in one way, but in other ways, there's so many contradictions within that. And now, again, using Syria, we can see how Russia obviously has also treated Syria in that sense, which aggravated a lot of people. I could sense the exasperation when we saw Putin obviously shaking the hands of Jelani, which is somebody that up until a year ago, Russia was actively combating Jelani and his men, and this obviously outraged a lot of people. But this is the thing. Russia is currently engaging in a very sort of similar diplomacy as China. They understand at this point that since the fall of Assad has happened, they need to try to engage in at least some sort of diplomacy and see if they can influence Syria so much as possible so that it does not fall completely into the hands of the West and Turkey and all the NATO states. It is trying to preserve whatever influence it can and its own sort of basis there, which, yes, a lot of people will, argue, oh, so they're functioning purely on interest. Well, that is sort of how diplomacy and politics works. And so I can understand the frustration. However, this is where I would be a little bit more reserved. I think for, China, Russia, and actually mostly China and Russia, it's very important to not go too far in engaging in diplomacy within the West's rule book in a way that will eventually enable their own imperialist ambitions. And I think that's a fine line that China and Russia especially are trying to navigate, because you do not want to also legitimize Western sort of creations that ultimately will threaten you. Because Jelani, for example, in Syria, and his allegiance, particularly to Turkey as a NATO state, but also obviously to the West, and being a very weakened country, is not an ally that is reliable to have. And so although Russia for itself is trying to navigate that in a way that will try to preserve its own interests, I think it's very well aware that it can't trust this new establishment and is treading lightly. And I think that is sort of the general approach that the BRICS leaders, let's just say, which is Russia, Iran, and China, have. And that is, even when you look at the BRICS summit declaration, it both counters the West while simultaneously not directly doing so and saying we are trying to exist within the institutions and the framework, but not necessarily directly challenging it so as to effectively not seem hostile, but also drawing in other countries of the global South into their periphery of influence, so as to be able to weaken, the West gradually. And this might not be to the liking of everybody, and I can understand that. However, it has to be done because at the same time, you are dealing with vast different countries with different ideologies, different economic bases, and you cannot impose upon them, a specific structure or ideology that they will view as a threat to their own particular state of governance. Those changes will happen gradually with time. What the BRICS states can do at this particular stage is provide a stable alternative for the global South to push back against the Western hegemony of these institutions and establish new alternatives that will allow for new states, developing states to find new alternatives and grow economically, industrialize. And that in itself, even the industrialization of, for example, a lot of the African states, particularly the Sahel alliance that is currently taking place, is weakening the West. It's weakening its empire, which has for so long relied on exploiting the South in financially as well as industrially, as well as for its resources, rather. So people have to be patient. It's strategy. You have to be very careful, but also be careful to not enable, I guess, the West to a certain degree. That's sort of my take, I guess.
Yeah, I mean it's very complex, isn't it, KJ? Because many have said to me who watch this program, don't interrupt an empire that's rolling down the hill toward its grave. By shocking it and provoking it into even further conflict. And then others have said, well, that war is already here. That what's happening in Gaza, that genocide, what happened to Iran in the summer of 2025, what's going on in Ukraine, the encirclement of China, that it's already here. But then, when I think about the critics, some of it, what I hear rests on an assumption that both China, Russia, even Iran, that they want to effectuate and influence to the degree the world in a way that's almost similar to how the United States does it, that they want to have spheres of influence, that they want to dictate terms for other countries in their own interests. And I think all of the behavior is contrary to that point of these countries. And I would go so far to argue that that's not only deliberate, but as Elina was saying, it is strategic in the sense that it not only brings benefits to these respective countries, but that it actually builds a path that's feasible at the moment when you do have a thrashing empire that's willing to do anything to get its way, including nuclear war, that it allows for humanity to exist while also, unfortunately, having to take a lot of lumps and not be able to do certain things, no matter how moralistic or how many morals, how many principles you may have. There are certain key limitations that keep you from doing everything that you might want at every given moment. KJ, what do you make of this moment? How do you see it? In same question that I posed to Elina.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps this is not a helpful analogy, but I think of like somebody like Floyd Mayweather, who is a consummate boxer, but his primarily approach was defensive. He would go into this kind of Philly shell type of a structure, and then he would let the other person punch themselves out, at which point he would respond. I think that once again, I think we have to understand that when people say, why isn't the BRICS doing something? The BRICS is not a security alliance. It's it's countries of the global South that are trading with each other. The actual security alliance is the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, and they are structuring themselves in order to create mutual security and defense. So they're looking, in particular, they're developing financial sovereignty or financial security. They're building economic security, in particular, energy security. And then they're also building out digital sovereignty, digital security. And this is a kind of sine qua non, necessary condition for the maintenance of the global South. They need to build out digital sovereignty as well as political sovereignty. So you can see them doing and creating the institutions and structures for all of that. And also, they are trying to build out a multilateral system that is built on win-win relationships that is different from the realist conception that essentially you have one hegemon being replaced by another hegemon, and then it's essentially it's inter-imperial conflict, and we're back to square one. It's just with change the faces and the names, but it's still the same system. The Chinese are trying to build out something which is different. It's something that harkens back to the older period when we actually had a Silk Road and countries traded with each other without constantly going to war with each other, as we saw on the European continent. And that is a delicate and long and difficult process. Essentially, you're trying to dismantle the master's house without using the master's tools. That requires an entire construction of different initiatives, different systems that China has actually put forth: the Global Civilization Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Governance Initiative. These are good visions and plans that are already designed to be built on the existing UN structure, which, for all its faults, has enough in there that we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's enough there that can be built on. And so you have a new structure that is being proposed. And then on the other hand, you have people who are realists or neo-realists, and they say, well, it's all going to be the same old story. It's all about hegemony, power, and domination, and we can never escape that cycle. China is trying to say that we need to and have to escape that cycle. And just one more, piece. The neo-realist or the realist, worldview is really a justification for imperialism. And to boil it down to its, simplest formulation, it's kind of a manosphere incel worldview that everything is about power and domination. And China wants nothing to do with that.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a great way of putting it. Well, I'll go. I have friends of this show. I have, many people who watch this show. They hold a very pessimistic view right now, and that I don't hold, actually, in many ways, because despite which is true of any period under the United States as a hegemon, but let's just take the collective 300, 400 plus years of Western domination. There are countless examples of atrocities, of horrors, of absolute disastrous conditions created based on imperial war making and the attempt to dominate the people and the planet. But then you also have the other side of it, which is the resistance to it. And in many respects, I see that resistance to it, despite taking blows. It's true. In West Asia, for example, Hezbollah, Syria, those are real. At the other side of it, though, you have for 2+ years the Palestinian resistance not only not giving up, but continuing to exist. And last time I checked, this whole new Gaza peace plan that is now supposedly in place is supposed to impose a kind of foreign technocratic government, a kind of occupation army of some kind of Arab states and who knows who. But it's been the Palestinian resistance, according to Al-Mayadeen, which has submitted and created a document which says, no, actually, we'll be the ones to administer any kind of political and economic rules and policies, etc., that they'll be the government. And that is kind of been the policy of the Palestinian resistance from the beginning. Now, when you look at China and Russia, the situation's, I think, even more positive, because it doesn't, what I'm seeing is that it actually isn't the regime change, the Ukraine conflict, the attempt to encircle Russia, the attempt to encircle China, the attempt to get rid of any of the so-called weaker countries that are allied with Russia and China, doesn't seem to be arresting their development. And if they develop and continue to develop, including Iran too, to the degree that they are, and that's only going to lead to more positive developments on the world stage, which I think we're seeing. I think this is why the Western media has to acknowledge that China has won the trade war. They have to acknowledge, I know, Elina, you wanted to talk about China's prowess economically and technologically. That's everywhere. Hell, go on Instagram Reels, accidentally look at one of them about China, and you will see many examples of how foreigners from the West and everywhere in the world go to China, and they're just impressed and amazed because there's robots that serve people, there's high-speed trains, there's state-of-the-art bridges, the tallest bridge in the world in Guizhou. Now, people have to marvel at that. And then, of course, Russia's military prowess. with missiles that the U.S. doesn't even have in their arsenal, weapons that the U.S. can't even claim, despite being the so-called biggest economy in the world and biggest military, can't even claim to possess at all. So I see it more as, of course, there's going to be ebbs and flows. There's going to be setbacks, and there will be even maybe temporary or circumstantial defeats. But the overall trajectory seems to be moving farther away from U.S. hegemony, despite what it does, whatever it is doing, whatever the U.S. is doing under Trump, under Biden. It seems to just be accelerating that process more and more. Elina, and then KJ, and then we can close. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I had it on mute again. I agree. This is the thing. I was actually going to follow up with a point as well that KJ just mentioned earlier. There's also a lot of significant things that are happening. If you look at the BRICS again, the sort of BRICS. I guess the declaration that was made. We saw that a huge one of the sections, or some of the sections within the declaration, I even advocated for countries of the global south to essentially become an integral part of the United Nations, to completely revamp or change the United Nations Security Council to give voice to countries of the global south, therefore eliminating the veto power of the more powerful states, or allowing it to be consistently under the domination of obviously the United States and the West more broadly. And at the United Nations meetings in New York at the headquarters in September, we saw a lot of countries within the African continent and in Latin America coming to the United Nations headquarters and actively speaking about what they call, I guess, a drastic reform of the United Nations. Now, I would simultaneously argue to be a little cautious of that as well, because at the end of the day, when we're looking at the United Nations and its establishment and its legal structures, they were created for the purposes of preserving capital and the capital interests of the former colonial powers. I've often referenced this before. I would advise people to look at the Hall Doctrine, HULL Doctrine, that was pretty much the foundation of the establishment of international law, and it was meant to prevent countries of the global south that were becoming newly independent from being able to essentially economically develop and on their own. Yes, again, within the scope of that, the United Nations, it has been used by the West systematically to preserve its own interests as opposed to that of global South. However, now we are looking at the fact that countries of the global South are looking, if not to reform, if that isn't to take place, we're going to be looking at alternative infrastructures from basically developing. And as I said earlier, and I think you also touched on this now, Danny, the reality of the situation is that given the fact that China is an economic powerhouse and it's engaging in international trade that is primarily, resource orientated and infrastructure orientated, meaning in many instances, kind of exchanging resources for the building of schools and hospitals and industrial capacity. We're actually looking at many countries in the global South developing themselves industrially, and developing industrially is fundamental to basically removing yourself at a state of poverty and therefore reducing the ability for the imperial core to be able to exploit you. And it has been on the backs of the global South that the imperial core has been able to even have the kind of quality of life that and also the wealth that it's been able to accumulate. When that ability to exploit becomes basically obsolete, then that means that the imperial core can no longer exploit it. So working within these avenues and seeing the fact that China is constantly growing and economically sort of kind of bringing along other countries in the global South who now are seeing alternatives to simply financial sort of debt that doesn't actually do anything in terms of production and growing their economies, but rather actually indebting their economies to the point of mass austerity and crippling their economies and preserving them as agricultural-based states. China is offering states the ability to basically emancipate themselves gradually whilst working within the framework of the United Nations, stating that, yes, it still abides by international law, but actually looking to reform those institutions gradually in favor of the global South and pushing out the West. Like I said, this can be somewhat, again, a bit tricky to work within the parameters that has been established by the capitalists to preserve their own interests. However, I do, the way that Russia and China are operating, it's allowing for the global South to develop the infrastructure, the economic, political infrastructure to push back against Western imperialism. And so that is a positive that is taking place, although there are losses that are occurring. As what I said earlier, Syria being one classic example, it's not sustainable in the long run. But what China is creating is a stable base and economic trade relations and financial institutions that are going to push back against the West. And also, again, like KJ also said, they're also looking at creating a even tech autonomy and intelligence autonomy, and breaking free from also, the West's control over information and all these and all this software and intelligence kind of tech. Intelligence that they've been using to abuse the global South up until this point. So by establishing these sort of stable economic conditions, China is allowing the world the ability and the sort of mechanisms by which to gradually push back against empire. But it is a slow burning process. And something to also add here, we also have to remind ourselves that this will have a detrimental impact on the working class of the imperial core, of the EU, of the United States, who are feeling the wrath, who are sinking to further poverty within the United States. And this is going to create massive reactions. I mean, if the protests are anything to go by in the United States now, this is only going to get far, far worse. And as that happens, it's going to completely disintegrate and destabilize the entire political institutions of the United States. And it's going to chew away at the liberal institutions, which we're seeing Trump do now. I mean, it's turning gradually into this fascist state, effectively. And as that happens, it's going to create mass chaos within the imperial core that will not be controllable, whilst Russia and China and Iran, even in Iran, for example, even though there is...
Oh, it looked like we lost Elina. Maybe KJ, pick up where you want.
No, I'll just pick up right where she said, there is rising wrath and dismay and anger and frustration in the imperial core from the working class. Absolutely understandable. It's almost inevitable. But we have to note that, 20 years ago, the people at Davos put out a report. They were just doing some long-term predictions. And they were saying, look, everything is good for our rentier elite class, but we have to be very, very careful about resentment and civil disturbance, because they see these vast inequities and they see their lives becoming constantly enshittified, and they see themselves working themselves to the bone with nothing to show for it. And we have to prepare for that. And then not long after that, you saw, for example, millionaire foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation put forth these grants for creating quote unquote resilient cities. Resilient cities, there was an entire layer of talking about, creating general resilience, but understand it was an agenda to also create powerful police forces and surveillance mechanisms to tamp down on any civil resistance. And that process has been developed for a long time, not simply, for decades, but actually, even if you go back to the era of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, there's a clear understanding that capitalism was reaching limits, and that in order to make capitalism productive again, you had to discipline the working class. How do you discipline the working class? You cut out all the social supports, all the welfare, all the, social commons that the working class relies on in order to have a decent living. And instead you force austerity. And as you force austerity and hyper competition, you have to have a mechanism for managing the inevitable social dynamite that you are creating. And so we saw then, starting from 1974 until the current moment, the US prison population has increased 7-fold. And we have seen this constant militarization of our police forces and our cities. So you see that the kind of structure of police state repression was being built out for a very, very, very long time. And now we're seeing it being put into very, very concrete action. As people have said, it's not a profound observation. Capitalism in decay results in fascism. So we're seeing this acceleration towards a fascist state. And also we understand that, as the global north is no longer able to expropriate and exploit and extract from the global south, well, that creates, a general malaise, not simply the undermining of the labor aristocracy and the anger and frustration that creates, but also a general malaise in the global north. It's that line, post imperium omne animal tristi. After the empire, all animals are sad. We're looking at the sunset of empire, quote unquote. The end of history and the last man. This language was already implicit since the 1990s. And so then we have to understand, once again, what do we do and what can we hope for? What is there? What can we hope for? My belief, similar to you, Danny, is that there is hope. And I believe that hope will come from the global south, in particular from the sovereign socialisms of the global south. There are multiple socialist experiments happening in the global south. And for decades, the US has destroyed all of them. But for now, for in this iteration, it looks like that they have a chance of flourishing and growing, in particular, the sovereign socialism of China. Men make history, but not as they please, right? The conditions have to be right. And we are seeing that what has happened with the rise of China and the rise of the SCO and the BRICS and Russia and Iran is that we're seeing the conditions that are being built out, whereby the global south can actually have viable sovereign socialist experiments, which are essentially, they're in a certain sense, they're the logical development of capitalism. As capitalism reaches a monopoly phase, you essentially have corporations that are taking over the role of government, and therefore the government should take over those corporations, nationalize them, and develop them for the general good. This is the advantage that China has. The US is saying that, China has these unfair advantages. The unfair advantage that China has is called socialism. It's socialist policy, socialist planning, and socialist vision. That is the advantage that China has. And there's nothing to say that the United States cannot actually transition to that as well if the working class makes that demand. So I think that it's important for people in the global north to make the demand of their governments, A, not to go to war, certainly not to escalate to nuclear war, stop undermining and overthrowing governments around the world, stop sowing chaos around the planet, but also make the demand to transition to a different system, to a system that is not exploitative, that is not genocidal, that is not constantly creating havoc, chaos, and human suffering, both for themselves and for the rest of the planet.
Yeah, no, I think those are all great points that you touch on, KJ, because as I'm trying to wait for Elina to come back so she can get her final word in response to what you just said, though, KJ. I wholeheartedly believe that, and there she is now, so I'll just make my point quickly. I wholeheartedly believe that it is the 100% correct approach to navigate this world order right now, with the thrashing, desperate, and declining U.S. empire dominated and controlled by the most rapacious, profiteering entities of capital, that to engage in any kind of behavior or activity that mirrors that entity is to essentially leave yourself up for your own kind of overreach and overstretch, which China learned a lot from the Soviet Union during the last decades of the Soviet Union, in particular with what happened in Afghanistan, which, while I wouldn't say was the reason the Soviet Union collapsed, it was certainly a mitigating factor, because Brzezinski and company were able to draw in the Soviet Union and essentially keep it in a years-long war that was not winnable. And so China will never do that. And a lot of them now in the multipolar world, they are not going to do this, because they're not going to follow any kind of model that looks like the United States, because to do so would be to fall into its own trap. Because right now, the U.S., all it can do is violence and just the most horrific, covert and overt military operations that amount to war crimes. Any kind of tit for tat will just be a drain on not only the national interests of these countries, but also their projects globally, which are very strong and very effective. And nobody anywhere that is in the camp of wanting a multipolar world, wanting a liberated Palestine, in Palestine, and beyond, wanting to see the good things that people hope for with the decline of empire, a strengthening of a new world. Those that are participating in this project are not making certain kinds of demands that I feel like a lot of critics of the multipolar world make, a lot of critics of China, a lot of critics of Russia. And I believe the reason for this is because I think, for example, the Palestinian resistance, or the Yemen's Ansarullah, Iran's government, its resistance, I believe that they know that it has to come internally first. Like, your first line of defense and toward victory is going to be your own self-determined struggle toward that end. And once you get to a point where it is possible to engage at a higher level internationally, then that's where major assistance can come. And that's where a lot of opportunities that we don't even see right now and can't even imagine right now can come. So I think that's exactly where we are. And I like that what you said, KJ, that men make history but not how they please, humans make history but not how they please. I think that's exactly the calculations, the strategic thinking, the ways in which the more advanced, I would call the more advanced forces in the world are moving. And I think it's important to impart that message and interpret it for Western audiences. Elina, you got cut off though, so you're back, and I want you to give your final thoughts as we close up here. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I've been having a lot of technical difficulties this evening.
Right.
Based on the conversation, obviously, that we're having, I guess to finish it off on a more positive note, is that I would agree with both of you in the context of, and I think, as I was trying to say earlier, is that there is a lot of, I would say, revolutionary almost potential. We are seeing, countries of the global south looking towards alternatives, which wasn't the case 10.
Lena, you're cutting out. Unfortunately, it looks like there must be some kind of connection problem on your end. I don't know if you can hear this. You seems like you're back.
Yeah, I can
do a quick ER-san. That's Chinese.
Yeah, I think I'm back.
Okay.
I'm back. I do apologize, everybody, for the technical difficulties. I'll try to just be quick. I'll just try to be very quick then, just to salvage the situation.
No problem.
What I will say is, I will just say this very quickly, just in case I get cut off again. I guess where I was going with all of this, effectively, is that there is. Even if we look at something like the Sahel Alliance, for instance, the Sahel Alliance was only plausible in many ways, not just because of the revolutionary potential and the leaders, with people like Ibrahim Traore, for example, who at the age of 37 is obviously a rather inspiring figure and is looking to liberate his country, bring industrialization to his country, to industrialize Burkina Faso, and obviously create the kind of economic conditions that will actually allow the people to prosper out of their own wealth rather than have it sort of extracted from the West. That was possible because Russia had provided military assistance, and now, because of China, because China exists, because of the BRI, because of BRICS, Burkina Faso has that ability, which had China not existed, to be able to enter into this kind of trade and economic agreements that will allow, the Sahel Alliance as a whole to be able to grow and to prosper. The fact that they were able to kick out the French, I mean, this was really true. I mean, even though they technically, colonization had ended several decades ago, the reality of this situation is that the financial hold that the French had over these Western African states essentially classified them as a form of neo-colonialism. They just found a new avenues by which to control these states, these countries, and now that has come to an end. And that was possible because Russia provided what it does best, its military and strategic intelligence, to the Sahel Alliance to be able to, push back against Western imperialism and against all their forces inside of Burkina Faso, which it's still battling against, but also providing it with the, China comes in as well as Russia to provide them with the kind of, economic base by which to kind of push back against Western imperialism. And that is what China sort of represents. And I guess this is what I'm trying to get at. It might be, people don't necessarily appreciate this, but what this will effectively do is weaken empire. And by weakening empire and by weakening the imperial core, effectively, gradually, you're eroding away at it, whilst itself is collapsing on its own contradictions, its own financial capitalist structures that are simply unsustainable, and then therefore trying to also push towards sustaining their imperialist hegemony around the world that is simply no longer able to do. It will collapse on itself. And the best thing that Russia and China and Iran can do, and that's essentially what they're doing, is to keep on the track that they are. And China is doing a lot in terms of providing the kind of economic conditions for that weakening to take place. And these are some of the positive things that are taking place. But this is a war. There are battles that will be won, and there were battles that will be lost. Syria was a loss, and that is something to be concerned about, for example. But like I said earlier on, that's not long-term sustainable. And we're already seeing how even in the comprador states within West Asia, we're already seeing sort of even friction within them, because although they align themselves with the Western imperialism, they still have their own interests that contradict one another. So there is this transnational alliance up to a certain point, but ultimately at the end, they still have their own interests that they need to preserve. And we're seeing that take place between Turkey and Israel, and then obviously the Arab states have their own agenda, etc. So it's not long-term sustainable. Whereas China is sustainable, and BRICS is looking towards establishing a long-term project that will allow these states, the global South, effectively to grow and push back against Western empire in a stable and proactive way. I guess that's the best way I could summarize without extending this any further.
No, that's great. No. I really appreciate it. I think we can close here. I put, Elina, your links to Substack, YouTube in the video description. KJ, is there anything I can put in the video description for you so people can check out?
They can just look for me on various websites. I talk prolifically and write and publish prolifically. And I just want to remind the listeners, the Pentagon considers the mind to be a battlefield. And they're looking to occupy your mind. So what we have to do, every single person has to reclaim their own mind, the mental sphere for themselves, think critically for themselves, and build relations with other like-minded people. And then we have to do three things. One is prevent world war, or actually we have to, curb our own governments from enabling genocide. There's a minor dip in the rate of genocide, but it's a 70-year process in Palestine. And so we have to continue to put pressure, curb our own Western governments from continuing to. We have to prevent world war, in particular, against major powers. And the last thing is we need to demand socialism. I think those are the things we need to keep in mind.
Yeah, indeed. It's all connected. There will be no better life for people in the collective West, in the United States, anywhere in the world without the end to these wars. But the United States, especially in the collective West, have a deep responsibility to end these wars. And really the only way to end these wars if you have a political and economic system that is amenable to stopping wars. That is not possible under a dictatorship of the weapons manufacturers of Wall Street and the like. So that is the historic task in front of us, everyone who's watching from the collective West. And of course, the global South is engaging in their own for self-determination and people-centered development, socialism, etc. With all that said, everybody, thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday. It's getting late for Elina out there in Cyprus. So with that said, I'll be back on Monday Monday morning, I think. So be sure to watch out for the YouTube notifications there. I think it's Alistair Crook on my schedule. Hit the like button as you go. You can find all the links to support this channel in the video description, where you can find Elina's work. Of course, continue to follow KJ. He will be a regular, continuing ongoing here on this channel. You can find my to support this work here, Substack, Patreon, and so much more. With all that said, everybody, I think we can end the show here. Have a good rest of your Saturday, if it's still Saturday where you are. And if it's Sunday, get some sleep or something like that. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.